our series, The Women Who Stay, and our fall series is Women Who Stay, the Women Who Endure. So those of you who have stayed with this program since its inception know that we began by spending time with women in the Bible. So one different woman each time we met, and kind of looked at her, learned from her, prayed with her, and we used scholarship, groundbreaking scholarship from Catholic women scholars. And now this fall series, we are so privileged to have these very scholars come to us virtually and share a little bit about their experiences and their scholarship. Maybe how the scholarship has changed and also how it's changed them. So tonight, I am so pleased to be able to welcome and introduce Sister Carolyn Osick. So Lynn Osick is a sister of the Society of the Sacred Heart. She received her doctorate in New Testament and Christian origins from Harvard University. And for 26 years, she was professor of New Testament at Catholic Theological Union and is now professor emerita at Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University. She is the author of many scriptural books and articles, some of which we've read, past president of the Catholic Biblical Association and the Society of Biblical Literature. She is a former associate editor of the Bible Today, which I just recently subscribed to, Lynn, and book review editor of the Catholic Biblical Quarterly. In 2009, she retired from full-time teaching to become the provincial archivist of the Society of the Sacred Heart, United States, Canada province. So, welcome, Lynn, and thank you so much for joining us. Can't believe you accepted our invitation. We feel so lucky. We're going to start with prayer, which is in the form of song that Lynn has suggested we begin with. And then we'll open our conversation. And just to reiterate, in case any of you came on after Ashley gave her housekeeping notes, if you could keep your audio on mute throughout the conversation. And then if you have questions, if you would put them in the chat box. I think everybody knows how to do that by now, hopefully. But and then when we turn to questions, we will, Anne or Ashley will call upon you to unmute and ask the question that you've written in the chat box. So you can do that. And then we'll plan to finish by 6:45, no later. So Anne, I think, has our song queued up. Beautiful, Lynn, wondrous. I feel so at peace. Welcome again, and thank you so much for coming. Yeah, it's good to see you. So we wanted to hear some about your experience as really on the forefront of Catholic biblical scholarship, and maybe one of the earlier generations of women to pursue that at the level that you were able to pursue it. And wondering if you could share with us what drew you to your field of Catholic biblical scholarship.
Well, it's thanks so much for the invitation, Liz. And you had sent me a list of questions in advance that you might ask. And so I've had them on the screen all day. And every time I'm not doing something else, I go back to these questions. And that's the first one. I think it was a class that I took at a master's level that was sort of a required class by someone who was a biblical scholar, one of our sisters named Carolyn Sullivan at Manhattanville College. And she was from a different generation. She had a very different kind of experience, but this was a class on the Gospels, and it just hooked me. I just knew that this was what I wanted to do. And I was reflecting on sort of the evolution of Catholic biblical scholarship and where I dropped into it today. Her generation from before Vatican II and during Vatican II was a very different kind of experience of Catholic biblical scholarship, because they were just beginning to kind of break free from what I would call ecclesiastical restraints in their scholarship, and able to really look at what the rest of biblical scholarship was doing, which was all Protestant, of course, and Jewish. It was really at Vatican II that kind of broke open. Now, I was just coming in right after that, so I never experienced those restraints, so it was a very different thing for me. But the attraction to the New Testament specifically was, I really think, came through that class. So went on from there. And
so that was at Manhattanville, that was your undergraduate or master's?
No, actually it was a master's class in the Society of the Sacred Heart in the province at the time. After first vows, we were to spend 2 years in theological study. That structure didn't last very long because it wasn't workable for a number of reasons. But I was right in the midst of that. And so I was sent to do this master's degree in MAT, Master of Arts in Teaching, in religion at Manhattanville College. And that's what I was doing there.
So, and were there many of your, I guess, sisters that were studying with you at the same time who went on then to do doctorates?
There was no one who was in that particular group, I don't think. But there certainly were some others. One who was 5 years younger than I would single out, Barbara Bow, who was, she and I did dissertations at Harvard with the same same director, and then we both taught at CTU for a long time. Tragically, she died in 2010. But she's the one who really stands out to me as also interested in that. And then Ann Johnston, who was a bit older than I, who just died recently, was in Old Testament at Boston University. So there were at least 3 of us who were in biblical studies around the same time, and went on to teach in biblical faculties. Yeah.
And did you face any barriers as a woman, as a Catholic sister, when you began the pursuit of that study?
I've been thinking about that, and I really have to say no on that. And that again was because of the difference in generations. Catherine Sullivan was the first woman to be admitted as a member of the Catholic Biblical Association. That was in the 1940s. She was the only one for a very long time, and then it was kind of a novelty to have a woman doing this. By the time I came into it, it was still, there weren't very many of us, but it wasn't a novelty. It wasn't something that raised eyebrows, you know. So I was really at the beginning of I would say the flowering of Catholic biblical scholarship. One of the ironies is that, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but from around the early 1900s, there were directives that came out of the Vatican that were really against historical criticism. And historical criticism was what you did if you were a biblical scholar at that time, in those years. And so there was this great resistance to historical criticism. By the time I was in biblical studies, that's what you did. And ironically, in 1994, the Pontifical Biblical Commission came out with a wonderful document on the Bible and the life of the church, extolling form criticism, historical criticism, you know, so it had really switched. And right in the middle of that, sometime in the 1980s, was this Vatican investigation of Catholic seminaries. And by that time, the heat was off of biblical scholars. They didn't care what we said. The one question they had was, are the correct forms of historical criticism being observed, being done? I mean, it was just a total about face from 50 or 60 years before that. By that time, it was the liturgists who were on the hot seat, you know, and so we weren't.
Can you define that for us, historical criticism, as it applies to biblical scholarship?
Historical criticism was a method that began in literary criticism, really, in Europe, mostly in Germany and England, and was adopted, was discovered by biblical critics, biblical scholars, well, beginning in the 1880s, 1890s, really, and developed for another 70 years or so. And it's form criticism, it's historical criticism, source criticism, analyzing texts from the point of view of trying to establish their earliest form, which would then be the more authentic form, and therefore thinking that you have something, getting back to something that would be the purest form. For example, Jesus' sayings in the Gospels. What's the original form of the saying? And how, and redaction criticism, also part of this, how has the Gospel writer used it, editorialized on it, developed it? And then you get into the Synoptic Theory in the three Synoptic Gospels. How are they related? Is Mark the first one, et cetera, et cetera. And really that held sway, I would say, until the 1990s, when people began getting a little restless with this and saying, you know, maybe it really doesn't answer all the questions. And there were critiques coming at it, particularly from the point of view of pastoral theology. What does this have to do with the life of the church? And you can give a beautiful historical critical analysis of something, but that's not a sermon. That's not a homily. You know, how does it connect with people's lives? And that whole methodology really was not able to do that. Right. But to go back for a minute to the sayings of Jesus, you know, trying to say what's the original saying? Well, now you see we're working much more with theories of orality, for example, and using the social scientists who've worked on oral cultures and realizing there is no original form. If you tell the same story again and again, it's always going to be different every time you tell it, you know. So that's an example of historical criticism and its strength and its limits. Yeah. You know.
So and feminist biblical scholarship
Yeah.
uses all of those tools: redaction, source, form, historical criticism. And I know you've written that there isn't just one way of approaching scripture from a feminist perspective, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I guess, what approach you've taken when you've studied scripture through a feminist lens.
Okay. Let me back up for a minute and say that one of the false assumptions of historical criticism was that it was ideologically free. Okay, no biases, no tendencies. Well, actually, what we realized was it was white male European. Whenever you analyze it, whenever you approach a text, whenever you do this kind of thing, you do have biases, and so you need to say them up front. Okay, so once that was okay, then you could say, all right, I'm going to approach this from a feminist perspective with a set of assumptions, and the assumptions in feminist analysis are that the text is biased in favor of the male perspective. It's biased in favor of patriarchy. It's biased, in favor of those who control things. So you come at it from that perspective and you see different things. And now, to be a feminist critique, there are many different ways of doing that. I have always thought that if you're going to do biblical scholarship for years and years, you're going to fall in one of two directions. Either you're going to be more attracted to the historical social analysis, or never mind what it meant then, what does it mean now, and a literary analysis. And most women go for the literary analysis rather than the historical social, but I'm in that historical social category. That's what really interests me, because I think it does give us resources for understanding what it means now. And so the feminist analysis there is going to take the form of, for example, looking at the construction of gender in the culture. It's going to take the form of looking at how patronage functions and how women participate in that social construct. I've written on that, and those kinds of things, those kinds of examples.
So I'm going to quote something from one of the article that we sent around for people to read in preparation for tonight. You said, the Bible is for the church. It does not belong to biblical scholars, theologians, denominational committees, or bishops. It belongs to the people of God. And this is a very broad question, but
let me just stop you for a minute. Because let me stop you. Colloquially, I wanted to add something. I did not put that in print. The Bible doesn't belong to biblical scholars any more than the liturgy belongs to liturgists.
Yes. Okay. So wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this feminist biblical scholarship can help us today, your scholarship and others, enhance our understanding of the Bible and appropriate its meaning for our lives or for our church. I mean, because one of the things we've done with our series is try to bring that scholarship into the parish, and there hasn't always been a way for the groundbreaking work to work its way into our lives as practicing, struggling Catholics. So I just wondered, I guess it's a very broad question, how do you see the scholarship impacting the life of the church today and our lives as Catholic women and men.
The Feminist Scholarship.
Yes.
Yeah. I think one of the most important needs is education of people about the fullness of the scripture. We're still working with a lectionary that systematically excludes some of the most important readings about women.
Mm.
All right, get people to know what those are. Every time I look at a lectionary reading and there are skips in the verses, it's going to do 9 to 11 and then 15 to 16. It sends me right to the Bible to look at what is being left out. And sometimes it's stuff that really isn't that relevant, but sometimes it is.
Right.
So that's a kind of a hermeneutic of suspicion that you can use with the lectionary. So in terms of feminist theology, feminist analysis rather of scripture, I think that's an important thing to really know what's really there, to feel empowered by it, even if we're dealing with still with a very patriarchal church and patriarchal structures. I know nothing about your parish whatsoever. Are all the people here mostly from your parish?
I think so, though we advertise it more broadly. So, and now that it's Zoom, we may have people from all over the country, but it is a parish program out of Holy Trinity Church.
Okay, I know nothing about your parish. I'm not critiquing it. It requires, what's really important is a certain openness for the leadership of the parish. To allow people to pursue, to ask questions, to come up with alternate structures of worship and ways of doing things. It can be done, but it takes initiative on people's part, because in most situations, it's not going to come from the official leadership. Now, maybe it is in yours. I really don't know.
Well, I cannot speak for the other 80 or so or however many people are on the call, but I will say that our series is called Women Who Stay, because we've looked at the women who stayed with Jesus at the cross, but we're also women and men who are staying in the church sometimes through lots of prayer and struggle. And it's very encouraging what you say about that. It can be empowering to see what's left out of the lectionary. In your own experience, are there some sort of gems, either in scripture, stories or sayings, or something else in your scholarship that's helped you to stay, to be a woman who has stayed in a patriarchal church?
Well, there was a book I wrote that wasn't really biblical called Beyond Anger on Being a Feminist in the Church. I wrote that in '84. It was published in '86. That was my kind of working out of it myself. I received enormous positive feedback from that book. I mean, at one point this is before email, I had a pile of letters this big.
Wow.
From people who wrote to me about it. The church is home to me. And there were times when I looked around and I didn't see anything better, really. And the richness of the liturgy and of the history, particularly women's history, just is something that I am very. I continue to be empowered by. My parish here is the cathedral, the St. Louis Cathedral. I don't know if anybody knows it. It's the largest collection of mosaics in the Americas. It is absolutely beautiful, and the liturgy is okay. It's patriarchal, and sometimes my friends say, "Well, how can you do that?" Well, I don't pay much attention to what they're doing up there, frankly, in the sanctuary. I'm just totally caught up in these beautiful mosaics that inspire me, and that I feel like, I'm part of that tradition.
I have been in the cathedral, and I agree, it's absolutely stunning.
Mm-hmm.
The mosaics are absolutely stunning. Are there people that have encouraged you and inspired you? You've mentioned Kathleen Sullivan. I don't know if she... Catherine, sorry, apologies. She continued to be a mentor to you. There were other in your journey point to that kept you going.
Yeah, Catherine Sullivan and I were separated at a distance, and I really couldn't say that she was, after my time at Manhattanville, that she was much of a mentor to me, but she was a model. We talk a lot now about the importance of mentoring from people who we are like, or we feel like we're like, we want to identify with. There wasn't much of that for me. I have to honestly say that. There were no female faculty members at Harvard when I was studying there. It's a question I never raised until people started asking it more recently. But there were people who encouraged me, certainly. I mean, friends, community members, yeah. When you're doing doctoral work, as some of you may know, particularly when you're doing a dissertation, there is nobody else who knows or cares as much about your topic as you do. It's a kind of an isolating experience, but you have to love it. You have to love staying in it.
Right. Well, what is on the horizon, do you think, for Catholic biblical scholarship, like some unfinished business or some more of the depths to plumb? Do you see sort of what you hope scholars who are maybe just getting their PhDs now, or are new to the field, or is there an area that you hope that they'll kind of run with or develop a little bit more?
That's a hard question for me, because I'm 10 years out of it right now, except that I do write every once in a while, and I do talk every once in a while. But I would hope that younger biblical scholars would continue to try to make the links, create the links between the scholarship and the people.
Yeah.
To encourage everybody to love the scripture, to develop ways in which their scholarship can be shared in very simple ways.
Nice. Well, thank you. That's our hope too. I would love to, I've seen a few questions come up in the chat. Anne and Ashley are monitoring that. And I'd love to, unless there's something I haven't asked you, maybe the others will ask it. I'd love to open it up to others' questions at this time.
So Liz, one comment I will make is I want to thank Lynn for mentioning her book, Beyond Anger. I read that soon after it was published, and it really helped me with my own struggle and journey. It's still on my bookshelf. So I've posted a link, an Amazon link to that book in chat if anyone's interested in buying a copy of that book.
Are there still print copies around? My goodness.
Well, yeah, there are.
Oh.
You can get it new or used according to Amazon.
Oh, I don't think you can get it new. I think it's out of print.
So, well, first I want to acknowledge Suzanne Noonan's comment that maybe at a future session we need to look at the omissions in the lectionary, which would be an interesting session to have. So thank you, Suzanne. We will keep that in mind. Margie, you posted a question about things that Lynn has learned that has surprised her as a result of her study. So I'll put that question to you, Lynn.
Mm. Well, one of the things that continually surprises me is how much longer it takes to write something than I think it will take.
I hear you.
Yeah. I think well, I've done a lot of work on families, family life in New Testament period, and I think one of the things that surprised me there was the way in which Christian families were just so like other families. They didn't stand out. There were some things that were different, of course, that distinguished them, but they weren't that different, you know. They were part of their own world, just as all of us are part of our own world. I mean, that would be one thing I think that surprised me. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. So Margie, I see you have other questions. I'll come back to those. I want to go to Jane Malhotra first. Jane, do you want to unmute and ask your question about Jesus's missing years?
Sure. Yeah. I just wonder what feminist biblical scholars are maybe beginning to uncover, or also uncovering about those years between his teens and when he was around 30 and began his ministry, and any connection to Eastern religions. I have Hindus in my family, and I've noticed a connection between Jainism and the teachings of nonviolence and ahimsa with Christianity and Jesus's style of parables and creative response to violence. So I wondered if anybody's looking into that or what you've seen.
Okay, about the hidden years you're talking about. Yeah. Well, the answer is we don't really know much, but there were speculations from early on. You know, there are at least 2 infancy gospels that talk about Jesus growing up, and they're full of miraculous stories. They're entertainment, you know. But Luke says he was about 30 when he began this, and I think we are simply to understand that it took him a long time to come to the point where he felt he had to do this, that he had to get on the road and start talking and do this. We tend to think of 30 as fairly young. In that culture, with the kind of life expectancy, 30, you're well into middle age. So he was not young. He was not considered young. He was considered a mature person by that time, you know. But about those hidden years, you know, there's just lots of speculation. We have to assume that he was living a village life, a craftsman's life, the way anybody would. And then it doesn't have to necessarily mean all of a sudden. It could be a buildup from a long time of reflection that at a certain point he starts doing this, you know, being an itinerant missionary. I missed the connection with the nonviolence, though. Can you say a little more?
Well, I've read some scholarship around the idea that he was actually in India, and the connections with Jainism and Hinduism are sort of intriguing, and I just wondered if anybody was exploring that, or if there'd been women who had, or feminist scholars who had explored that you know.
I don't know about that, if there are, but let me just say the idea about Jesus being in India may come from the traditions that sparked the so-called Acts of Thomas. There is a large collection of literature. It's a long collection of stories called the Acts of Thomas that are, we tend to think they're maybe 3rd century. They're pretty late, but in them, Thomas, the apostle, goes to India And he, remember that in John's Gospel, he's called the twin, Didymus. Guess who his twin brother is? Jesus. And the twin brothers, who Jesus is now risen, of course, the twin brothers go to India. So well after the resurrection. So this is legendary material, but it could be connected to the traditions about Jesus being in India.
All right, thank you, Jane and Lynn. So Margie, do you want to unmute and ask your question about the calling her work feminist theology and what that means for people?
Sure. It's kind of a two-part question in a way. And the first is being known as a feminist theologian or a feminist scholar, does that automatically put you into a path that where others don't enter? So and related to that is the whole idea of how to get the things you've learned in other feminist scholars, how to move that into the mainstream thinking about Jesus. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, being a feminist scholar doesn't necessarily preclude others being there or preclude your being something else, you know, because I also do a lot of social science scholarship, using the social sciences in biblical interpretation. I think every biblical scholar is a little bit eclectic. You don't only use one method, but you kind of prefer one, you know. And the second part of your question was?
How to bring the feminist thinking and perspective
into the mainstream. Yeah. Well, it has to be comprehensible. It has to be palatable to a certain extent so that people can take hold of it. Feminist scholarship is, I would say by now, it is mainstream in biblical scholarship. Okay, whether it's mainstream in what people are interested in what people read, I think it is. You know, Barbara Reed from Catholic Theological Union now has this whole series called the Wisdom Commentaries, you know, that it's going to be a single volume on every book of the Bible, done from a feminist perspective. Now, the other intersection here is the whole thing about cultural diversity and the way in which we realize that biblical scholarship has been Western. It has that biblical scholarship in other traditions has been marginalized, and now we're trying to bring everything to a center. And one of the things that the Wisdom Commentaries is doing is deliberately getting feminist scholars from different cultural milieu to contribute to these volumes. And so none of these volumes are written only by a single person, but probably edited by one or two, but with contributions from feminist scholars from very different cultures. And that's a very enriching thing. And that's one of the things that is going forward now. But cultural diversity, trying to get cultural diversity is, you know, that's in everything now. And it's certainly a major effort on the part of biblical scholarship as well.
All right, thank you for the question, Margie. Lynn, we actually had Barbara Reed come to Holy Trinity last year to speak with us. So it was a wonderful evening.
Mm.
So I have a question of my own. I'm one of those liturgy people. So one of the things I continue to be concerned about, and I'll talk with Catherine Vincey, who's going to be part of this speaker series about this too, is where we are with inclusive language. Inclusive language both in the translation of biblical text, inclusive language in our lectionary, inclusive language in our liturgy. So I'm wondering if you can maybe give some sort of assessment as to where we are, because there have been times like when Gail Ramshaw and you and so many others were writing about inclusive language, and it's just really exciting material. And it just seems like that's not front and center in our conversations right now.
It's stalled, I think. Because it was a big issue at one time, and then some changes have been made. Certainly publishers are quite aware of it in books and articles. But in the liturgy, nothing much has happened. And it has permeated some other cultures now, some other languages. It's not only English, but it began as an English language thing, and it began in Europe and North America. And as long as in Rome they could say, well, that's just a American European thing, English language thing, it wasn't that big a deal. And I don't know. I don't know exactly what to say about it. It is stalled, and I think we're not making enough noise about it. We've sort of acquiesced to it. And so maybe what it needs is another round of people objecting to it, women objecting to it.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Lynn. I tend to agree. I have my Georgetown students read at least one article about it. And the struggle always is that the scholarship on it is from now 20 years ago or more, 30 years ago. And it's hard to impress upon them that this is a current sort of issue and need. But then the college women that I have, it's really the first time they've ever heard that topic opened up.
Yeah.
And for that, they're often grateful. They're sometimes shocked. They don't quite know what to do with it. But it's their first hearing
But
about
why
it.
haven't they heard it before, you see,
Right.
before they get to college?
Right, exactly. And it's not there for them. So thank you.
There is a new edition of the New American Bible, which is the lectionary translation, that is being worked on. And I've seen some of it, and it does make attempts to use inclusive language fairly well. But that's going to take a few years yet to come out.
Right. Well, I think you're right. We need to start making more noise about it. And let's see, we have other questions coming in the chat here. So Ashley is asking, so Lynn, last week we had Dr. Bernie Evans from St. John's talking with us about voting Catholic. And he had made a comment that, one of the struggles is that Catholic social teaching is really not taught very much in seminaries today, which is really depressing. What about with feminist theology? Is feminist theology, is a feminist perspective taught in our seminaries? It is.
Unlikely. Even that 1994 text from the Pontifical Biblical Committee, the Life of the Bible in the Church, it goes through a number of methods, and when it gets to feminism, it's sort of tiptoes around it. It says, there is this new method, and it's good, but you got to be careful not to overdo it. I think the institutional church is still very much afraid of it. So is it going to be taught in seminaries? Not very likely. a place like Catholic Theological Union, certainly it will be brought in to biblical courses because you've got women teaching them. But I think, well, for one thing, a lot of men think that it's not theirs, but it can be. You know, male teachers, male interpreters can get on that wavelength and understand it. It's something like white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're part of the default group, you don't notice it. You don't really notice what's going on with the other. But in the case of women, we're quite aware of it. Men can be conscientiousized about it. It's the same thing with being a Black or a person of color. You know how you're left out of the society. And white people, unless we are educated to it, unless we learn, we don't realize it. It's a very similar phenomenon.
Good point.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate that analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just going to say, Ashley had a follow-up to her question, if you want to unmute and ask it, Ashley. It's related to this topic.
Well, it wasn't really a fault. It was just then it's really up to us to ensure that this is being taught in Catholic school and morning RE and on our Monday nights. So.
Yeah, and if the name feminist, if you're afraid that'll turn people off, don't use it. Just, but do it, you know? Raise the
Right.
Right. Lynn, are there, so I also think not only in the inclusive language front, but in a feminist in approach to Bible and so on, is part of the task is educating our preachers.
Mm-hmm.
What are the types of preaching resources that you think preachers should have? Both the ordained preachers, but also women who are preaching and laymen who are preaching.
Oh, well, that's a big question. And that's, you know, it's not really my area, but things like that series Catholic Women Preach, you know, so that some actual demonstrations. There are a number of sort of daily reflections. The homily helps, you know, there are all kinds of those. And, you know, I wouldn't be able to pick one out rather than another. Maybe some other people here want to recommend some. I regularly read Give Us This Day, and I contribute to it. But there are others, Magnificat, there are all kinds of others. And there are there are some that are written explicitly for homilies, particularly put out by deacons. So, you know, there are abundant resources available. If you just take the time to look.
So Liz, did you have a question?
I might have forgotten it. I'm thinking though that the wisdom commentary that you mentioned, Barbara Reed's series, I think could be a really great resource once all the books are available for preaching, and to read the commentary to get a little of the historical context or the literary interpretation of a particular passage and then reflect upon it. I think I was going to say that when we wrap up, we'll also say this, but one of our guests in this series did teach. Jane asked about Jesuits. Do they learn this in seminary? And at the Jesuit Theological Union, or I don't know what it's called now, out Santa Clara, Berkeley area, Sandra Schneider's was a teacher there, and she's still emerita, and she taught our pastor, Father Kevin.
But see, it shouldn't only be women who do it.
Yeah,
you know, it isn't mainstreamed sufficiently. You know what I mean? That it's really part of how we think and how teachers think, any more than anti-racism is mainstreamed yet. We're trying. but it takes a lot of effort. You know what I mean by mainstreamed? You know, that it just becomes part of what you do.
Right.
That's
Not
right.
some new,
Yeah, that we don't.
Gadget.
Right, that we don't actually have to draw attention to it and point to it to say, this is it.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. So Margie, you had another question. Oh, you're still muted.
Which question?
There you
I'm full
go.
of questions.
So,
Okay.
so about the church's process for giving imprimatur and so on.
Oh, sure. Okay, so I grew up in the 50s and 60s and went to Catholic school. And whenever anybody had a book that was related to faith or a holy thing, we had to look for the imprimatur in the front, and we weren't allowed to read it if it didn't have that. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering, does your scholarship and the scholarship of other feminist theologians, or even just general theologians, have to get a church blessing to be released?
No. No, I don't think I have an imprimatur on anything I've written. where that still is active is probably for elementary and secondary classes, particularly in a Catholic school, particularly in a diocese that requires it. The dioceses are responsible for religious education in Catholic schools, and even private schools have to comply with the diocesan regulations, and in some cases that is required. But at the college level, no, that it just, you know, it is just not relevant.
Thank you.
I edited the Anselm Academic Study Bible in, what was that? Would have been around 2010 to 2012, something like that. And they did want to get the imprimatur because they want it used in Catholic schools, in high school classes. It was a bit of a struggle, but we did. We got it.
Thank you.
So Lynn, someone asked, again, this is a big question, but I'll pitch it out there anyway. How do you think the Catholic Church would be different if women could be ordained?
Yeah. I hope it would be very different, but I'm not such an optimist that I think everything would change, because women are just as subject to fallacy as men are. But I think there would be a lot more, well, assuming that we have a critical number of ordained women, huh? Okay. I think there would be a lot more attention to family issues. I think some of the sexual things we get hung up on could be more easily resolved. I would hope there would be good preaching. Shall I say better preaching? And I would hope that there would be more declericalization. I'm not optimistic about the new guys who are being turned out by seminaries now these days. I think there's really a return to clericalism more than the people of well, my generation, but there's another one in between. It would be, for instance, my children's generation, who would be the parents of the seminarians. You know, kind of look at them and say, what? Where did they come from? So I'm not terribly optimistic right now about declericalization, but I would hope that if there were a critical number of ordained women, that would be different.
Thank you. Liz, you have a question.
I do. So maybe it's not a fair question because I'm sure you love many of the biblical women, but I wondered if there was one in particular who you've studied, who really is a model for you about women's leadership or the potential of women's leadership or co-leadership in the church? Is there someone you pray with or sort of look to?
Well, I have to say two. I can't choose between two of them. One is Phoebe in Romans 16, who is, she's called a diakonos and a prostatis. Whatever a diakonos was at that point, she was, of course, the later deacon. I don't think they're deacons in the way we understand that now, but definitely an agent of the church. And she's a benefactor of Paul. Paul says she's been a benefactor to me and to many. So she's a person who is probably a hostess of a house church and a very generous person who uses her influence and her patronage in effective ways. And the other is Prisca, the wife of Aquila, because there you have a husband-wife ministry that seems to function very well, and that Paul is very fond of both of them. So I think they're a model for team ministry, of many kinds.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. So if anyone has any other questions, I think I touched on the ones that were posted. But if anybody else has a question, you could raise your hand. I don't see anybody raising their hand. Oh, wait, we have a new message. So Lynn, a couple of people are asking whether you yourself have ever felt called to priesthood.
Yes, I see that question. I'm looking at the questions now. The answer is yes. There was a time in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, all the way through that time, I thought, I believed I would have responded to the call. And then I came to a point later, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when I decided that I would not. And my reason for that is that I think anyone who accepts ordination now should be willing to be full-time in pastoral ministry because the need is so great. So in other words, not to be ordained and then be a scholar teacher. And after a certain point in my life, I realized I'm a scholar teacher and not a pastoral minister. So for that reason, I decided that should it be offered at this point, I would decline. But earlier on, yes, when I wasn't quite as settled in the scholar-teacher role. Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say I think certainly your scholarship is a form of ministry, and I'm so happy that you have that vocation because it does have a pastoral implication for all of us, and so we're grateful for that. And I think if we have no more questions, I just want to say again and again, Lynn, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all of your work and your contribution. Thank you for being a woman who has stayed and endured and contributed in such a fruitful way. We're so appreciative.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Wonderful.
When we would, of course, like to invite you if you are free and you want to come. We're meeting the next 3 Monday nights. So we will have a liturgist one evening, and we'll have a theologian and a scholar of spirituality. And we're really looking forward to those conversations and their experiences. So all of you are invited to come. Please register and have a good night. Thank you again.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.